making money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. on the East Coast, to talk about careers, professions, I should say, professions, and all subjects related to wealth building. So topics can range from um, you know, writing a resume to and optimizing your LinkedIn profile to talking to people who have interesting careers, like my guest last week, Benjamin Inman, who is an estate planning and a firearms law attorney. So yeah, what do those two things have in common? Nothing. Happens to be the two areas of law that Ben enjoyed practicing, and so I invite you to go to our YouTube channel and check out Benjamin's episode. Got quite fascinating and great information that he had. If you are a firearms owner or are considering acquiring a firearm, you certainly want to do so lawfully. So today's show is really an outgrowth of a conversation I had on Monday evening with a friend of mine, Michael. We meet every Friday night, virtually anyway. We used to meet in person, but Michael doesn't live in California anymore. And we talk about a broad range of topics. And one of the topics we talked about dealt with wealth. And Michael was expressing to me some thoughts about his perspective on what that is and what it means and how it impacts his life. And we ended up having a very deep discussion on this topic. And I realized that for all of the discussions we've had about how to become wealthy, how to handle wealth, how to invest, all these things, I've never talked about this fundamental concept of what is wealth? What does it mean to be wealthy? How does one define it? All of these sort of fundamental questions. And so I decided to take today to do that. And this is going to be somewhat of a freewheeling discussion, or talk, I guess is a better way to put it. And hopefully it'll give you some food for thought, some ideas about what being wealthy means to you, what becoming wealthy means to you, so that you can have a sense of what am I really after in this result, or in this area, I should say. So I'm sure you've all heard of situations of people who their raison d'etre, as the French say, their reason for living is accumulating wealth. And it seems like, they do so for its own sake, with, nothing, no other goal behind that. So I will say at the outset that is not my approach at all. I don't see the point of piling up a huge amount of money merely to have a huge amount of money and be able to say, I guess, well, I've got more money than whoever. From my perspective, money is first and foremost a tool that we use in order to live the kind of life that we want to live. And so the question isn't how much money am I going to acquire, and then how am I going to live my life? I think the question is, what kind of life do I want to live? And then how much money do I need in order to live that life? I think that's a much more physically, mentally, spiritually healthy approach to this question of wealth than to think of it the other way around. And unfortunately, I think most people are forced into dealing with the question from the other direction, i.e., well, this is the money I have, so this is the life that I can live, and they get stuck there. living paycheck to paycheck, et cetera, never really accumulating any assets. And that's unfortunate, because they're probably not living the life that they really, would choose to live. Here in the United States, I think we're fortunate that, with some thought, some planning, we can oftentimes take that decision more in our own hands. I'm not saying we can control events. I don't think that's the case at all. But the younger we start at this, the more likely we are to be able to see our wishes come to fruition. And and so again, that's the perspective I'm going to be talking about. And um, and a lot of it is going to be, how does one move from having finances and control my life, to how do I flip the script, so to speak, and create a life that then um, dictates, if you will, what I need to be doing when it comes to finances and wealth building. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So for my own situation, um, I want to be able to do certain things in my life. So I want to be able to live comfortably, not have to worry if I'm going to be able to pay for my house next month, if I can afford food, if I can afford to repair my car, all of that. So that desire in my life requires that I have a certain amount of either cash on hand, so that I don't have to worry about paying those expenses, and or a stream of income that's solid enough that I don't have to be concerned um, with those expenses in the coming months. Or I need to be able to have access to be able to borrow enough, with the ability to pay it off, without a major disruption to my lifestyle. So those are three ways of attaining that particular life goal, okay, or lifestyle goal, if you will, right? And I think most of us, if not all of us, would like to be free from day to day worries about money, right? We don't want to have to go to the store and you know get our groceries and then get to the checkout and realize, oh my gosh, I've got too much in my cart. I'm going to have to go put some things back, or I'm not going to be able to buy these things because I can't afford them. Aside from it, of course, being embarrassing, it's very difficult, especially if we have a family and we need that food to feed our family. So for me, my first life, that's my first lifestyle goal, and that specifically relates to my financial situation. So my second lifestyle goal, and I say this somewhat tongue in cheek, but when I talk to young men, especially, and the subject of marriage comes up. So they seem to think that if they're not handsome enough, or they're not kind of physically built enough, or whatever, they're not going to be able to attract the kind of mate that they want to attract. And I always tell them, and I don't mean this in any derogatory way, but the fact of the matter is, the most attractive thing that a man can have who's looking to have a family is a solid balance sheet. This is not to say that women are money grubbing. I don't mean it in that way at all. What I mean is, for a woman who is also interested in having a family, that's inevitably going to mean that, at least for a period of time, while she's probably toward the end of her pregnancy, and while shortly after the birth, she's not going to be able to work. That's just the physical reality of childbirth, and she is going to want to have the physical, emotional, and spiritual comfort of knowing that her husband, can take care of things financially, while she is going through the very, difficult process of having a child. And so, it's a completely legitimate, I think, want on the part of a woman who's considering getting married and having a family, to want a husband who has demonstrated that he is financially responsible enough to have accumulated some wealth, some savings, so that when it does come time to have a family, that she's not lying in bed feeding the child, worried about how she's going to buy her next box of formula, or how she's going to how she's going to pay for the next container of diapers, or whatever it is, right? And presumably, as a man and as a husband who wants to start a family, you wouldn't want your wife worried about that either. So as someone who you know respects marriage, and desires to be married, so that applies to me now. At my age, frankly, I'm probably not going to be starting a family. But one never knows, I suppose. There's always the example of Tony Randall, who had a child when he was in his, I think, early 70s, if I'm not mistaken. And again, I say that somewhat jokingly, but I think that no matter what stage of life a person is in, having financial stability, having savings, having investments, is a very attractive feature when it comes to building a relationship with someone, with the intention of getting married. It says a lot about a person, that they've been able to do that. So that that's a second goal. So and saying that certainly it's a goal that I have now. Exactly how well defined those goals are, how big they are, what they really mean. So that, of course, is an individual decision, and it really depends. In the state where I live, California, those numbers have to be bigger, because it costs much more to live in California than it does in a state like Nebraska, or even Florida, where costs have risen in Florida as more and more people have moved there. Housing prices have gone up, but they're still nowhere near what they are here in California. Just the other day, I read the median home price in California is $900,000. I mean, that just seems mind-boggling to me. But okay, I'll take it at its face value. And but in the national median home value, I think, is somewhere in the low 400,000, so roughly half of what it is here in California. And of course, that's a huge increase in the last few years, because I think the median home price back in 2019 was, gosh, I think in the low 300s, maybe, or something like that. So all these factors play into it. And I'm not going to get into the details of my financial plan, and all of that, only to say that these are the kind of things I mean when I say, what kind of life do I want to live? And then what does that mean financially, as opposed to, well, I make, I'm just picking a number, $4,000 a month. And so what kind of life can I live making $4,000 a month? Um, Again, that's, I think, how a lot of people end up having to live. And it's unfortunate, because this country, the United States, affords us the opportunity to change how we do that. It's hard work. It's a lot of discipline, but it does. So I think that's one principle of becoming wealthy that we want to look at, is what kind of life do I want? And then what does that mean in terms of finances? Okay, as opposed to the other way around. So that's number one. Number two is, what does it mean to be wealthy? Right. So if we were to go back to the 19th century, the 1800s, right, what to be wealthy meant something, I think, pretty specific. What it meant was a person had enough investments, and those investments were paying enough income that they didn't have to work. That's what it meant to be wealthy. Okay. And in general, that coincided with the class that someone held in society. So if we look at England, for example, where the class structure has always been more defined than it is here in the United States. So you have the aristocracy in England, or what's sometimes called the landed aristocracy. And in the 19th century, to be a member of the upper class, the aristocracy, and wealthy meant that your estate was generating enough income that you did not have to work. And in fact, aristocrats, it was considered unthinkable, really, that they would work, to the point where they did not typically even manage their estate. They had an estate manager who did the day-to-day management, and they merely consulted with their estate manager from time to time and made certain sort of high level decisions. But other than that, everything was left to the estate manager. And the gentleman, the aristocrat, the member of the upper class, he spent his time in what were sometimes called idle pursuits, things like hunting and other sports. Some men engaged in scientific endeavors, and there was quite a bit of scientific discovery that was done by essentially aristocrats who had a tremendous amount of time on their hand. They had financial resources because they didn't have to work. And so because they were wealthy, right? And so they did different types of scientific research, and were responsible for some pretty amazing discoveries in the 1800s. So that's what it meant to be wealthy. Anyone who worked was either in the middle class. They were either they might have been a tradesman of some kind, or in trade, meaning they might have imported and exported goods, or they might have been a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, somebody like that. And although they may have been able to accumulate a fair amount of assets, they weren't part of the aristocratic class, and they weren't looked on as being wealthy in the traditional sense of that understanding, because in order to maintain their financial level, they had to work. Okay, only if they got to the point where they didn't have to work, and they might buy themselves an estate, maybe even buy themselves a title, did they become part of the upper class part, and become what was truly considered wealthy. So here in this country, in the United States, we never really had an aristocracy of that type, certainly not a hereditary aristocracy. And in the United States, wealth meant something different than it did back in England. Here, it meant someone who had built up a substantial estate of assets, but rarely did that person not work. So even in the South, which was the most like England, where you had large plantation owners, and oftentimes the owner of the plantation did not directly oversee the plantation. Nonetheless, Southerners were much more involved in business matters than their counterparts in England would have been. They were probably involved in the sale of their crops, whether it was tobacco, cotton, indigo, whatever it was. And they might not have worked 6 or 8 hours a day, but they probably did work at least for a time every day, and then after they were done, they went hunting or whatever, did their sports, etc. But they were more involved in business matters than, like I said, their counterparts in England. And in fact, unless they had inherited their estate from their father, they probably in their early days had worked hard to accumulate the wealth that allowed them to build a substantial estate, to build a plantation. And so while as they became wealthier and they had more land, more assets, more investments, they might not have had to work as much, because they, in essence, grew up in the adult sense, working. They never typically never lost the habit, so to speak. And so we had sort of a landed gentry in this country, not an aristocracy, but they typically worked. Now that was prevalent in the South, although it really comprised a fairly small percentage of people in the South. Most Southerners did not own big, huge plantations. That's kind of somewhat of a myth about American history. Most Southerners, had small farms and or were tradesmen, that kind of thing, or they were, coopers, barrel makers. They were blacksmiths, those kind of things. Okay, that was much more typical for a Southerner than to be a huge plantation owner. In the Middle States and in the North, most people did not have large estates, large in the sense of land. They didn't have large farms. There were a lot of farmers in the North and the Middle colonies, but they weren't huge farms. Generally speaking, the farm owner was actively involved in farming or farming and ranching if he had animals as well, or maybe he had horses, so he was raising horses, whatever. Or they were involved again in a profession, lawyer, newspaper publisher, Benjamin Franklin probably being the most famous person in that regard, or they were involved in trade. So in New England, there were a lot of people involved in shipping, and while typically, if someone was involved in shipping, so they were also involved in trade, meaning that while they may have made most of their money off of carrying goods, oftentimes they would take advantage of the fact that they were sailing from point A to point B anyway, and they would carry some goods on their own account in order to make some additional money in trade. So the vast majority of people in the North and Middle states, worked. I mean, they did not have they may have been wealthy in the sense that they owned a lot of ships, and so those assets were valuable, or they may have built up a farm, and so they had land that was valuable, or they might have had livestock, again, horses that were valuable. But the wealth they had was much more closely tied to the work that they were doing, than it was for the landed aristocracy in England, where they didn't work, and their investments, they lived off the income from their estate. So we going especially from the 19th to the 20th century, more and more societies, including England, moved into this newer definition of wealth. And these days, I don't know what percentage of the landed aristocracy in England still live off their wealth, but certainly the numbers are much smaller than they were 100 years ago. And there's no stigma attached to being a lord or for that matter a duke, and being employed in some way. So Julian Fellows, for example, who's the creator and producer of Downton Abbey, one of my favorite shows, right? So he is a member of the aristocracy, but he produces media projects for a living, right? Now, again, 100 years ago, that probably would have excluded him from polite society, or maybe 150 years ago. But today, that is surely not the case. And I suspect that he's accorded a lot of respect, especially because of the success of Downton Abbey, for example. So there are lawyers, there are investment bankers, there are undoubtedly doctors, all members of the aristocracy, but they work, and I think one of the things we find is there's a lot of value in working and not spending our time doing things like hunting and sports and doing whatever. And I think that's an outgrowth, by the way, of from the 19th century, when these wealthy men got involved with science. They weren't getting paid to do the science, which is one of the reasons they could do it. They were occupied, but they didn't have a job, so to speak, right? But they had a reason to get up each morning. They had things they were curious about that they could engage in intellectually, and that's an important factor in our well-being. And so I think what we've seen over the last 100 to 150 years, as the concept of what it means to be wealthy has changed, is going back to that first principle that I mentioned, which is, what kind of life do I want to have? And then what financial resources do I need to have that life? So even for the landed aristocracy in the 1800s, their money, the fact that they were wealthy, dictated the life that they could have. They weren't going to work. They weren't going to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. Or if they did, they were really putting themselves outside of the norm of their class. And there were social repercussions for doing that. So, we think about having very little money as dictating the kind of life that we're going to have. But it used to be that even being wealthy dictated the kind of life that we were going to have. Nowadays, while that's still the case for people who do not have a lot of financial resources, at least on the upper end of the spectrum, it's been recognized that wealth is a tool. It's not an end in itself, and we need to make an affirmative decision about the kind of life that we need to live. So I think that's the second principle, or the second factor, I guess, to look at is, we're no longer constrained on we don't have to be constrained on the low end or on the high end by our wealth. That the definition of what it means to be wealthy is different today than it used to be. And so we have a broader opportunity to define what being wealthy means to us as individuals, as opposed to having to conform to a societal definition of what it means to be wealthy. So that's sort of principle number two. Principle number three is, what does it actually mean, or how does money actually make me feel? So this was something that I think is has a big impact on our lives, on our relationships. It has a lot to do, I think, with how we're raised, how money was dealt with when we were children, how what latitude we were given to deal with money as we grew into our teen years and then became adults. So For some people, and there's no judgment connected with this, but for some people, to have you know $10,000 in the bank makes them feel very comfortable, makes them feel wealthy, relieves them of financial worries. They have what might be called modest expectations in that regard, and so for them, that's being wealthy. Um, Other people may feel like, well, unless I have so much in assets that I could quit working and just live life on my own terms, I don't see any point in, you know, delaying gratification in order to get to that point, because I don't see myself ever getting to that point. I would need, pick a number, $5 million in order to be able to quit working and have enough money to live, have enough income off of my investments to live the life I'm going to live. And since I'm never going to get to that $5 million, there's no point in my saving. I might as well, kind of live the life that I want to live now, and I'll just work until I drop, so to speak. Um, those are, very different perspectives. And by the way, that's just two. There are probably as many perspectives about what money means, excuse me, as there are people, in the world, or at least people in the world who think about these questions. So I think the third issue we need to consider is, what is my attitude toward money? Okay, so I know for me, I look to balance how much money I use to support my current lifestyle versus how much money I set aside in order to achieve my financial goals. Now, one of the things I've struggled with over the years is, what exactly should those financial goals be, and how realistic do they have to be? So when I was a young man, going back into the early 1980s, when I was, first starting off post college, had my first job, and I was starting to think about, what does money mean, and what does it mean to be wealthy, and all those kind of things. So, and then I started my first business in 1986 at the grand old age of 26. So I made a goal at that point that by the time I was 30, I was going to have, I think it was something like $7 million, because then I could retire at 30 and never have to worry about it again. Now, look, I didn't have enough experience to realize that, at least for the abilities that I have, and the values that I had, that generating $7 million of wealth in 4 years was an unrealistic goal for me. And needless to say, I didn't make it. I frankly didn't even come close. But through the process of setting that what turned out to be unrealistic goal, not achieving it, seeing what I could achieve over the years, I've gotten a better picture of what is realistic and what would be stretching but still potentially possible, if that's not if that's not redundant, what's possible, right? And I think when we talk about wealth and wealth building, one of the things we need to learn is, what is our potential? And again, mine is going to be different than yours. It's a difficult question to answer without any experience. On the other hand, I think it's a good idea to sort of take your best shot at what you think you're able to do. And if you make it, fantastic. And if you fall short, okay, so you fell short. So we pull ourselves up, we recalibrate our goals, and then we get back to work. So again, one of the things I struggled with, in when I was younger, was, if I set a goal, and it's not a goal unless it has a date attached to it, among some other things, right? You've probably heard about SMART goals, but a goal has to, first of all, have a date attached to it. By such and such a date, I'm going to achieve the following goal. Okay, so if we don't achieve the goal by that date, does that then just become a missed goal? And now for the rest of our lives, we have this non-achievement on our scale, so to speak, or what happens? And for many years, that's how I treated it, as okay, I didn't make this goal, so now I'll never make 100% of my goals, basically, right? I've consigned myself to, I don't want to say mediocrity, but I've consigned myself to, forever not being able to say I've met my goals. And as I moved into middle age, I realized that was foolish, because it was demotivating to have that missed goal just sitting there. So what I realized was that a goal that I don't reach is really an opportunity for me to rethink that goal and figure out a better plan to get to where I want to go. That plan may involve just, I need more time. Okay. It may involve, I need to change what I'm doing, change my behavior. It may involve, I need to change my beliefs. Okay. And all three of those have applied in my life over the decades. Okay. And by the way, for any given goal, it could be a combination of two or all three of those that have prevented us from reaching that goal. And so then we need to examine that deeply, recalibrate, and continue to move forward again. So, excuse me, principle number 3 then is how do I specifically look at money, and how do I use that view to set my financial goals? Okay. What is my capacity to meet the financial needs that are established by the life that I want to live? Okay. Now, we have to be a little bit careful, right? Because like in my case, retiring by 30 when I was 26, that seemed like a great goal, right? And I didn't make it, and it was better that I didn't, because retirement would not have been a fulfilling life for me. And so sometimes financial realities should drive us to then review, well, really, what kind of life do I want to live, as I better understand what my capacity is for generating income and building wealth. Okay, so we can't plan our lives in an entire vacuum, i.e., I'm going to be I want to be the person who builds, I'll use the Elon Musk example. I want to be the person who builds the most valuable, automobile company in the world, right? So, look, most of us are not Elon Musk. Okay, I will stipulate I'm not anyway. And if that were the life that I wanted to live, of building this company that literally changes the way people think about transportation, that would be foolish, because I don't have the capacity, I don't have the ability to do that. Now you might say, well, you if you really wanted to meet that goal, you would develop the capacity, you would develop the abilities. Well, perhaps. But for me, I've realized that I don't believe in that as a life's goal deeply enough to make those changes, right? And part of it is because I'm just not that dedicated to building an enormous business, and building an enormous amount of wealth that's necessary to build that kind of business. That just doesn't interest me as something to pursue in life. For other people, it does. For Elon Musk, obviously it did, but not for me. But I don't know that I knew that when I was 26 years old, starting my first business, and it was something I had to learn about myself over the years. So there's kind of a back and forth process of, as best we can, figuring out, step number one, what kind of life do I want to live? And then, step number two, and then step number three. Okay, so here's really how, my capacity for generating wealth. And now, are these two matching up? Do I need to go back to step one and recalibrate the life that I can live based on what I see my capacity in, being in step three? And that's important because in a way they connect, and there's somewhat of a cycle there, if you will. And that is so much of what life is about, right? It's about these cycles that we go through as we learn more and more about ourselves and about, our friends, our family, etc. How do these then affect the rest of our life? And that's as true in becoming wealthy as it is in anything else that we do. So while, principle one is principle one, the life we want to live should drive finances. We can't live in a total bubble, and not take into account, as we learn about ourselves, what our capacity is for generating wealth, what our capacity is for delaying gratification, for accumulating assets, right? Now, where I think it gets difficult is, America is a very consumer-oriented society. There's lots of wonderful things, to buy, whether it's clothing, right, or whether it's I don't know. I mean, there's a million things you can buy: cars and artwork and fine food and wine and all those kind of things, right? So there's always the next thing that one can buy, and the temptations are manifest, and so there's it's no surprise that that requires discipline in order to accumulate the wealth, in order to become wealthy to the point that matches with the life that we want to have, right? And so, for those of us who have insufficient discipline to get where we want to go, in the end, that is going to be a major factor in, as we work this cycle, right? So if we choose the life that we want to have, okay, and we understand now, what kind of wealthy we want to be, okay, and then we look at our capacity to become wealthy, right? This is where the discipline really comes into play, as we look at how quickly we're reaching step number one, okay? And if we're not reaching the wealth level we need to support the lifestyle we want, oftentimes that comes down to we're not exercising enough discipline. Now, that's not to discount. Sometimes there's bad luck. Sometimes there's economic downturns, and these things happen, and they can delay our goal. Okay, that certainly happened to me. So in the a few years after I started my company, very late 1980s into the early 1990s, terrible economic, well, not terrible, but bad economic times here in the United States, and almost lost my company. Really struggled through that period, but fortunately made it through and went on to much bigger success. So, I was, I think, pretty disciplined during that period. Despite that, the economics in the market were just against me for the business that I was in, and so I really just had to hang on as best I could until the economy picked back up and there was sufficient economic opportunity for me to then work toward meeting my goals, which I revised my goals and ended up meeting several of them. So the main thing, though, was the stick-to-itiveness, the resourcefulness. All of these are important qualities to develop as we work toward becoming wealthy. All right. And that oftentimes the difference between being able to become wealthy enough to fit the kind of life that we want comes down to further developing those qualities in us. And that's the hard part, because it's it's very difficult to look at ourselves and say, i'm not I'm not doing the job I need to do, right? um, that's a balanced statement. Not that I'm a bad person. That's not going to help out to say, oh, I wasn't disciplined enough, I'm a bad person. No, the second part doesn't necessarily apply. If you weren't disciplined enough, so then just, be mature enough to own that and say, but the next step is, okay, I was not disciplined enough. As I look back, I shouldn't have done, A, B, and C. Okay, so going forward, then, how do I act in a more disciplined way so that the next time the opportunity to do A, B, or C comes up, I won't be seduced into doing them. I'll be able to exercise the discipline to get through them and continue more directly on becoming wealthy. That's the productive way to look at these things. And I think that's another place where we get sidetracked, is we feel like we have to beat ourselves up if we have lacked discipline, or if we let's not say lack discipline, we've lapsed in discipline, right? And so we, everybody has a lapse in discipline. Even the most disciplined people have lapses in discipline. Okay. And it's part of the human condition, that we do that sometimes. The question isn't if we're going to do it. The question is when we're going to do it. And then the next question is, how do we recover from that incident of a lapse of discipline, and B, how do we prevent that same lapse again, right? Knowing that we may lapse in a different way going forward. Okay, so but the more times we lapse in discipline, reflect on it, build ourselves so we won't repeat that mistake, the less likely a lapse in discipline will happen in the future. Okay. And that's what it means to build ourselves up, to have the qualities that are required to become wealthy at the level that's necessary to support the kind of life that we want to live. Right. And, we could, this is, some people say, well, lack of discipline is a character flaw. Well, maybe. I think because it's a condition of being human, I don't know that it's necessarily a character flaw per se. Now, if someone has, no discipline at all, makes no attempt to develop discipline, revels in their lack of discipline, so then, we could probably say, okay, so there's a character flaw there. But that's someone who has embraced lack of discipline as a value, right? And for someone who's embraced it, so then, look, all by itself, that doesn't mean that, um, that it's a character flaw. It's a character flaw if what they want out of life requires discipline, while at the same time they embrace not having discipline. That then I think it's reasonable to conclude that this person has a character flaw. Okay. Otherwise, look, if the person, and by the way, for the person who is content with very small material wants in order that they don't have to exercise a lot of discipline, that's a completely legitimate way to handle that person's life. Okay. So you could say, well, that person is so undisciplined, and they have so little money. And it's like, but wait a minute, if they're living the life that they want to live, why is it any of our business to criticize how that person is living their life? I would argue it's not. They've defined the kind of wealthy they want to be, okay, based on the life that they want to have. And so they require That if that requires a lot less discipline than maybe what you or I want to do, so fine. And by the way, they may have gone through that cycle a few times and just realized what they have to do to exercise the level of discipline to have some other kind of life doesn't make sense for them. What they've decided to do is learn how to be content with a different kind of life than perhaps what they first imagined. And that's perfectly legitimate. That's all part of that cycle of going through and determining how really are we going to deal with these issues. So those are the thoughts that I have for you on becoming wealthy. Certainly not exhaustive. I think in the future, I'll address this topic again. But I encourage you to think about these. Think about, what does this really mean? Not in terms of dollars. In some ways, the dollars are the easy part. Oh, I want to have $1 million. I want to have 5 million or $10 million. Those are really easy numbers to grab at. Okay, but the question is why? Why do you want to have $1 million? Why do you want to have $5 million? Why do you want to have 10 million or $100 million? So you can be wealthy, so you can become wealthy. Okay, fine, but what does that really mean for your life? And that's the crucial question. So, fundamental principle I encourage you to consider is money is a tool. Money is not the destination. Money is, the vehicle that drives you to the destination. And if we look at money, I think that's a much healthier way to look at money, and one that will allow us to better live the kind of life that we want to live. Find our way to wow, right? That's the name of all, all the shows that I do, the Way to Wow shows, right? Way, who are you? Wow, what you want, right? So it's in the name of the shows that we do. And when we talk about people making money, it's people making money in the context of understanding who are you, what you want, right? That's the key concept there. So thank you very much for joining me today. Hope you found this interesting. If you have comments, questions, criticisms, feel free to share them. I'm not saying I've cornered the market on this kind of knowledge. I would be very interested to hear what you have to say on the subject. Obviously, it's something that I've given a lot of thought about over the years and the decades, and hope you have and or will as well, and interested to hear from you. So again, thanks so much for joining me today. So this is the last show for this week, and starting next week on Monday at 10 a.m. is my these are all Pacific time, by the way, is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. On Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, Business Lessons from the Military. And then a week from today, I'll be back with the next edition of People Making Money. So wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and a terrific rest of the week, and looking forward to seeing you next week. Signing off as I always do, Marie, you are my belle. All the best, folks.